just barely. At the end of the day, I don't have that many fish tanks compared to certain people, but for me, it's a lot. I think I had to actually do a count of how many bodies of water that I have before making this video, and it was something like, I got to 50 or in the 50s, I think. So that includes fish tanks, little tubs of baby fish, ponds, things like that. And I'm not gonna lie, at times it can get a little stressful. The goal is always to have as many fish tanks as possible, but they take up the least amount of mental space. Because you could probably imagine you have 50 some odd fish tanks and you're worried about things like nitrogen buildup or algae problems, maybe they're all display tanks, then it would get really overwhelming really fast. At least for me and my abilities to hold things in my head. You basically have to draw a map of which tank you have to be paying more attention to, which tank you need to do maybe more water changes on because something's building up too much. Like, it would just be crazy. So there are some kind of tips and tricks, or at least just things that I do that I've picked up over the last decade of doing this that help me to basically manage as many fish tanks as I do manage these days. I have a mix of things that are display tanks. I also have ventured into having like fish grow out systems or an actual fish room if you've been following along over the last few months. And I think ultimately if you're looking to get more fish tanks or figure out how you can have more fish and fish tanks in your life, then some of these things are gonna help you. We're also going to go through and add a bunch of fish to some ponds and some other things, some consolidation. That is also kind of part of it, I think. The first thing that's helped me out a lot with managing so many tanks is just setting them up in the right way. Big air quotes on that because there is no right way to set up a fish tank, but we try and do it in a way, or at least I do, in a way that's natural-er, not a word, but you know what I'm trying to say. We try and set up tanks that have a lot of live plants. We try and have an active substrate, whether that be potting soil, aqua soil that's meant for aquariums. I don't think there's a huge difference in the end result that I'm trying to get, but it's just something that is very biologically active because it helps everything in the system. It helps the fish, it helps the microorganisms that can grow because they just have the space to do it, and it helps with the overall ecology of the thing you're setting up. And all of that equals, hopefully, on paper, a lower maintenance thing, something that you don't have to like really slave over to get to look like this. But no fish tank is perfect, and there's a million caveats to this whole thing. This tank is a really good example of that. When we set this aquarium up a few months ago, I was worried because some of the plants came in with some algae we pulled from the tank inside that, you know, I was kind of hoping that that algae would just die off in this aquarium because that can totally happen. But what ended up happening, and I'm gonna have to dig through footage to find it, this aquarium for the last 2 or 3 months has been covered in that algae that came in with the plants. In that scenario, I did not get lucky. Nature did not do me any favors, and kind of what I figured might happen did happen. And I was getting to the point where I was about to just pull everything out of this tank plant-wise and sort of reset it. I was thinking about doing that. I'm so busy I didn't do it, but I'm glad I didn't do it. Because as you can probably, maybe, hopefully tell, there is really no more algae on any of the plants in here or the wood. Like, it was that weird green fuzz stuff that's really adhered to things. So I couldn't go in and pull it off. It's the type of stuff that you brush it with a toothbrush and it doesn't go anywhere. I don't think I ever did one water change to this aquarium. I was just patient and sort of neglected it a little bit, not gonna lie. We did little checks on it to make sure nothing was harmful for the fish, like we weren't building up any nitrogen or anything that would become a problem. But that patience that we had, or that neglect, however you want to think of it, ended up being exactly what we needed to do because the issue sorted itself out. Nature eventually came in. I just looked over at this tank one day and noticed that there wasn't really any algae in it. Something happened. Something that was promoting the growth of that algae finally got exhausted. I don't know if it was a form of nitrogen or if it was phosphate. I wasn't really checking for that. If it was a certain, maybe it was iron, like who knows? Something that algae was consuming rapidly to stay in place disappeared and it ended up offing itself. And we got the end result that we want. I don't know if it was an inconsistency in the fact that we did our DIY CO2 on it and then it went away, or it could be a lot of things, but I didn't do anything to this tank. I didn't tweak the light. I didn't do rapid big water changes, didn't do any water changes. All we have is a little bit of old Purigen that needs to probably be recharged on this thing. No fertilizers, no nothing. And I've kind of taken that approach to the different style of aquariums. These are not display tanks. These are where all of the rice fish and the guppies get housed to grow out and do their thing. We don't have an active substrate. We just have sand in here, which takes a little bit more time to get established. Doesn't hold as much surface area, so your microbial load is going to be lesser compared to something like we just talked about. But it's not a be-all, end-all. Like, it's not a requirement to get the type of tank you want. Like, some of these don't look great, right? There's more algae in them than you would probably want. I don't think anything about these is going to change. A display tank is just different because you're not dumping in a ton of that nutrient, that food, into a system. So there's always going to be that little difference, and you have to take a little bit of a different approach. These aquariums, I do have to worry about the buildup of nitrate, and that's primarily because of just the amount that we're feeding them, right? So we're trying to grow out juvenile fish, we're dumping them in. So these are tanks that I have to keep tabs on and that I actually have to do water changes to. The other aquariums, like the ones that we just looked at behind me, are ones where they're balanced enough, we're not adding a bunch of food, so we don't have to worry about them in that regard. Maybe these tanks would be better off if they did have a soil substrate of some type, because we would be able to maybe process more nitrogen, but that can get expensive, as I'm sure you know. So there's little things that you have to do to make everything make sense for you and your budget and what you're trying to achieve, but I think at the end of the day, go with a bunch of plants, and that's probably the thing that is maybe not the most expensive that will give you probably the best result at the end of the day. There's a million caveats to all of this. It's impossible to give you the exact recipe. Pardon all of the massive amounts of reflections. This room is crazy, but that's how we got this tank to be so low maintenance. Helps the load. I don't have to worry about this aquarium. It's how this tank inside is doing so good at the moment, right? We just have so much plant relative to water volume that there isn't really an opportunity for anything else to pop up. Now, if we went in and tweaked something, we turned the CO2 off, we adjusted the lighting, we could certainly still have an outbreak in an aquarium like this, and we have before, but the stability of everything and the plant volume relative to water, I think, is really important. Oh, and don't forget to put a potato on your tank, yam, whatever. This thing is like 6 months old. It's starting to thin out a little bit, but it is everywhere. All these things help and really get me to a point where I have multiple aquariums, not just display tanks, but ponds too, where I know the parameters in them and I know that they're not really going to change. So thus, I don't have to spend a bunch of mental space thinking about them. So that cuts down on a lot of the tanks that I have, and it's why I'm not going crazy every second of the day thinking about all of them. The only way that you know what your water parameters are, though, is if you test your water. So for me, it's gonna be test strips. I am a test strip, you know what. Insert the word that you're thinking. I use so many of them, and it's really helpful for especially the grow out tanks where I'm worried about nitrogen. The display tanks, not so much. I rarely ever test them because I just know that they're gonna come back all zeros across the board. I use the co-op test strips. I don't care what brand of test strip you use. I don't think it really matters. They probably all come from the same place anyway, but those ones are the cheapest. Just get a bunch of test strips, especially if you're gonna be embarking on having too many tanks, or at least an uncomfortable amount of tanks. It's gonna help you a tremendous amount, I promise. So for the tanks that I have identified as being ones that I need to monitor, again, because I don't have an automatic water change system, and I'm also not a fan of doing routine water changes on all of my tanks. It would just take too much time. All I do is dip the test strip in, let it go through the amount of time that it needs, and then if it's coming back with a reading that I'm uncomfortable with, or something that's going to signal me to need to do a water change, I just leave that strip on the tank. I remove all the other ones that are coming back at levels that I'm not concerned about or wouldn't warrant a water change. And I just go through my fish room every once in a while. Maybe it's once a week, maybe, I mean, it just depends on how many aquariums I have to be concerned about. It's usually the tanks that have probably too many fish in them, right? Or fish that are bigger, or tanks that I'm feeding more. So I have the usual suspects. I have the culprits of the nitrogen accumulation. So I know which ones I need to be testing, and that helps narrow down the amount of tanks that I have to pay attention to. I can just remember in this certain area or this row of tanks, the water parameters are fairly consistent and I don't have to test them as much. So I'm not using a million test strips every week. I'm not testing every aquarium I have. It's just something that I've learned about my tanks over time, and you will too. And please, it's summer, for the YouTube's algorithm's sake, write the comment about test strips not being as good as liquid test kits and that you should always use those. I don't completely disagree. I think it's very case dependent. The reason why I don't use liquid test kits is for a couple different reasons. One is that I just don't have the time. And another huge reason for why I don't use liquid test kits is because I don't really see the benefit in the resolution or the enhanced difference between 2 or 3 or 5 parts per million that test would give. Test strips are a little bit more difficult to interpret, although you could say they're just as hard to interpret as a liquid kit, but I don't need to know the difference between 5 ppm nitrite and 10 ppm nitrite. I don't need to know the difference between 20 parts per million nitrate or 40 parts per million. If it's off by that much, that's okay. What these things do is they tell me yes or no. So if I get a reading back and the nitrite looks like it's 10, but it could be more than that, then I'm definitely probably gonna earmark that tank for a water change. But if I do that same test and it's coming back very faint, it might be 1, it might be 5, but it's probably closer to 1, I don't care about knowing that it's 3, right? So it's really just, if it's dark pink, I'm changing the water ASAP. If it's light pink, or hopefully it's white, right, that's a 0 reading, then I'm not doing a water change. These things also tell me a little bit more about the water. So it reminds me if I use dechlorinator or not. It also tells me the GH and the KH. So I get an idea about the hardness of the tank, which is important for me because I have a mix of hard water tanks that I remineralize for the guppies, and then soft water tanks that I use for pretty much everybody else. So this little thing is almost instantaneously knocking out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tests, maybe 6. Chlorine isn't really that big of a deal. It's always 0. But I think you get the idea. That test strip doesn't tell you everything though. So things like phosphate, iron, in the excess nutrient realm, it's a little bit more challenging to do that. I think iron test kits are a thing. I've never really used them because I haven't been that focused on that particular element. Phosphate only when I'm doing experiments or doing comparisons and want to have that extra piece of data, but otherwise, I think it's something that you probably don't need to worry about so much. Ammonia is the only other one that I think you would really be concerned about. For me, and the reason why I don't really test for it is A, I'm not super happy with the ammonia test strips that they have. I think they're even less accurate than probably those things are. That's just me though, I might be totally wrong. But I also don't really care so much about ammonia. All of my aquariums are a pH 7 or below. Even the ones that I remineralize still tend to be around 7. And so ammonia is just not as toxic as it would be at even 7.5 or 8. Furthermore, ammonia tends to be, in at least my setups, pretty short-lived. So if it's a new system, we're adding things like an active substrate, a lot of plants, beneficial bacteria is coming in on those. If we do filter slaps, like ammonia is something that still might spike particularly if we're feeding a lot, but even then it seems to be pretty short-lived. It might be just a day or a day and a half where we can even detect it. It's at levels that isn't super high, and with that lower pH, it's not very toxic. So it shows up, it goes away. Nitrite and nitrate are the ones that tend to stick around longer. Nitrate might stick around for forever, kind of a situation. But even in tanks that are cycled, sometimes if you're feeding too much, you can get a little bump. Nitrobacter is slow at multiplying itself and doing its job. So all I want to do is see if there's nitrite and then how much nitrate. And if those levels, if they're dark pink, they're too high, change the water. If they're very light or they're completely white, then I don't have to do anything. So that's the full explanation on test strips. Hopefully that wasn't too boring, but that's how I do it, and that's how I manage nitrogen in my fish room. If I had an automatic water change system or a constant drip of one that was happening all the time, like I know some dudes have, then I wouldn't have to worry about it, but I don't have that, and so this is what I do. Let's take a little break from talking about all this stuff. We'll get back to it. We need to consolidate some fish. We need to give you some updates on some of the things that we've been doing over the last couple weeks. I need to accomplish a few physical things rather than just straight up talk to a camera. So wanted to show you this really quick. So recently I got my act together on my water changes to help me actually do my water changes in my fish room. So one thing that I was kind of annoyed with the Python system is that the hook that I was using primarily to fill the tanks, it's great. But if you want to go and then drain your tanks, you have to physically remove this piece and change back to the siphon tube and blah, blah, blah. I'm not really trying to vacuum up stuff all the time. And if I'm doing that, I'm just going to use a bucket and a straight tube. So what I decided was to extend this piece to go down to the bottom of a tank. And that way I can just use this one thing and I don't have to unattach and reattach things. So I found a piece of PVC tubing that almost fit this thing. I had to heat it up to kind of bend it and create a sleeve that would go over it. This kind of helped hold it in place, but then I also don't want to accidentally suck up fish. So I put a little double T-splitter thing on there and then hot glued some of the plastic netting mesh stuff onto the two ports, kind of like what we did with the big automatic water change valve thing we did on the big tank. Now I can just use this one piece and stick it in to fill and to drain, and it's awesome. And it saves me a bunch of annoying work going back and forth switching that thing. Just gave these guys a little water change with the new thingy majiggy, whatever we made. Worked out pretty good. Now I don't have to mess with switching it in and out every time when I'm doing stuff. But first impressions of the new egg trap, old school, manual mode. They are not into this. Thinking about trimming this in half, basically. So, I don't know. They just need to get used to having all of this random stuff in the tank. Hopefully they'll just swim over this and then go into here and do their thing. But just in case this is too much of a barrier for them, I mean, it's plenty of space. It's more space than this one. So hopefully this just works out and they just get used to it and do their thing. Temperature in here still fluctuates a little bit. It is on the warmer side. I don't think it needs to be 82 degrees in this water to get them to spawn, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's what did it for the other fish. Obviously being outside, they're getting a much bigger and dramatic temperature swing throughout the day. That water, I mean, right now it's been cloudy the last few days, so it's been in the 60s, and at night probably a little chillier, but then when it gets hot in the daytime, I mean, that water out there in that pond specifically can get pretty hot. I mean, mid 80s, probably even higher once we continue to get into more of summer. So with the temperatures being pretty stable in here, even though they're a little bit on the warmer side, they're kind of normal for an aquarium. I just don't know if that is probably the main trigger or not. I'm kind of thinking it might be though. The fish have been, I think, doing what I want them to do, which is breeding. Their colors have really turned up, and I made a new little device to try and collect the eggs. So this was the automatic egg trap. The fish don't seem to be very interested in this. We still don't have any signs of eggs. We're just sort of slowly collecting waste that ends up getting filtered or pulled through this thing. I think it's just a size thing. Like, these are big fish. This is kind of a small area. I have no doubt that this would work really good for like CPDs or smaller fish that are egg scatterers, but for my fish, they are not interested in it. So we went ahead and we made another little device. It's essentially the same thing, it just doesn't have any air suction up to anywhere. It's two baskets. I went through and I cut the bottom out of the basket and then just hot glued some of this plastic mesh that I've been using on things lately to the bottom, and then we sat that inside of another basket. And I used a couple rocks to sort of prop up and make this under area, which we can try and look for eggs. I'm running into the issue of this just being too small of a tank, because whenever I go feed, I feed a lot. I'm feeding probably way too much. Eventually, like, food ends up down in here. It's just an inevitability because I'm having to feed so much to get these females to produce the eggs. If I had a bigger tank, then we probably wouldn't collect so much waste down here. It ends up getting a little moldy. I don't know what that means for the eggs. Like, if we do get eggs down here, I don't see any. This has only been set up for a few days. I don't know if the eggs would automatically attract that mold and grow it, and so I'm really not doing myself any favors, but I can't exactly go in there and siphon it out or clean it out. I would have to just physically swap it for a whole nother one if the same thing is gonna happen. So I think I'm kind of spinning my own gears at this point. The answer is always a bigger tank. That's what I'm taking from this. But you can see the females are getting chased around by the males in this area. This is perfect. They should be spawning, like they should be shooting eggs, and maybe I'm just not trained enough to notice any eggs, but I think I would see little bundles of yellow eggs being scattered around in here. I think I would be able to see those, but I'm just not, I don't know, maybe I gotta move this thing a little bit, catch the light a little bit different, and maybe there is a ton of eggs down there. Maybe I could just wait until some of those eggs hatch, then I'd definitely be able to see fish down there, but they would probably just swim up through the mesh netting and get eaten immediately. So I don't know, I'm gonna give it a few more weeks, I'm gonna try a few more things, and if we can't get this to work, then we'll probably divide the fish, because I have been able to figure out which ones are males and which ones are females just by their behaviors and their colors. We'll keep half of them in here and continue to do this style and try and get it to work, figure out a system that is easy enough for me to do, and then the other half outside, and we'll just kind of let it go el natural, because I do want to have them outside and enjoy them in the pond type setting. The rice fish absolutely love these columns that we set up last week. I was really worried that it would kind of be a novelty thing, but you can see the yokihis down chilling in there. The black midnight Banaka rice fish there's always a couple of them in here. There's kind of a lot chilling in this one right now. Pretty interesting. They can get in and out just fine, so I'll come back over in 10 minutes and there'll be none in it. So they're able to get in and out. I can see them when I'm chilling on the couch. Like, that was the idea. Just this cool extra little element to the whole thing. And they haven't fallen over either. So somebody, more than a few people actually in the comments suggested, like, hey, just get a little piece of bamboo, a little skinny piece, have it go all the way down to the bottom, and that could help support it. And I think that's a great idea, but just given the fact that nothing has happened in the week that this has been set up, I think I'm just gonna roll with it. But if it gets windy or anything crazy happens, I'll definitely try that out. Thanks for hooking me up with that. And it looks like one of the things that I thought might happen, which was the plant regrowing in the column, is starting to happen with this one, where we cut a bunch of this to sort of prop it. This one not so much, just because we kind of pushed plants over. It does look like there's one piece of grass starting to grow up. The only fish that haven't, or at least I haven't observed them be in a column yet, is the sapphire lames down here. And they're actually the only ones that haven't started breeding yet. They're still a little small, but we already have eggs on our new yokihis. Glad that we got a couple extra of those fish from the good old Madaka lair. These guys, they're, like I said, they're a little smaller, so no eggs yet. The idea, or the goal at least, is hopefully we can just get them big enough to where we can get them breeding before the end of the season. Maybe in August, late September, you never know. The golden white cloud minnows are all gonna be hiding right now because it's the hot part of the day. There's one dude hiding back there, but they tuck themselves away. They tend to only eat in the morning and at night when they come out, when the water's a little bit cooler. Platinum Madakas over in this pond are still pumping out a ton of eggs on the mops, even though I know I've said a million times, if you want to collect eggs, don't put a bunch of plants in here. I'm sure that there are a ton of eggs within this plant mass, but we already have a lot of these fish, and we're still harvesting some. So take the mop. I don't know how many days it's been, but just set it in there, and we don't have to worry. Put a new mop in here. I gotta go find them, but that's how we're collecting so many fish. We're gonna be adding a bunch of fish to these ponds a little bit later, but we still have more to talk about. This pond is home of the Yokozuna lames, and they have finally started to put out some eggs. I think this one has most of them. Don't know if you can see those, but they took a little bit longer than the other fish to switch over and get happy outside. But this is a pond where we don't have any plants, there's no substrate. The water has this nice kind of almost green effect to it, and that's what's keeping this one from having any nitrogen in it. All the other ponds that have plants in them, like the ones that we just looked at, these guys, they will throw back zeros across the board, so we don't have to worry about them at all. And even those ponds that end up with green water, or a version of green water, maybe it's kind of just yellowy, that's still enough to really pull down those things that we don't need to then worry about. So we don't need to worry about doing water changes to these ponds, and we wouldn't want to do that anyway, because that would then disrupt the ability for it to suck down all the nitrogen. This is the last pond that needs to get a little bit of TLC, so the rainbow shiners, we'll call them I don't want to call them the reject rainbow shiners, the bootleg ones that weren't super colorful, right? They're all doing really good. This is in a bad spot. It's been cycling through a little bit more of having discolored water. I've been doing more water changes on it. I also threw in like a little sponge filter, not to try and complete the cycle of nitrogen, there's none in this thing, but to aerate it a little bit more, because this is getting really hot. It needs to get moved. I came out yesterday, it was almost 90 degrees. The water temp on this was in the mid 90s. I'm not really concerned about any of these ponds getting into the mid 80s or even the upper 80s. It's when we cross that threshold into the low 90s, then I start to pay a little bit more attention. When it hits 95, then I start to get a little concerned, especially for a fish that needs a little bit more dissolved oxygen in the water, like these rainbow shiners, but they were fine. So came out, added this, everything was all good. There's other techniques that you can do to chill out your water. If your pond has to be in a really hot spot, you can put in frozen blocks of ice. I didn't have that, but just for demonstrative purposes, I threw some ice cubes in one. That can help a little bit, but that's just an extra annoying step that you have to be concerned about. So going back to things that we can do to not have to add extra things to worry about, just make sure you don't put your pond in a dumb spot like I did. There's no way I'm gonna be able to actually get the footage while I'm talking here, but some of those rainbow shiners have started to color up. So that was a little bit of a, hey, maybe this will happen, maybe it won't, but the bootleg rainbow shiners from AquaHuda are starting to get some colors. They're not as good as the ones we got from White Cloud Dynasty, of course, but they're still a little bit younger. They still could color up. I noticed that their fins are a little bit shorter. That could also be a growth thing, and they could develop bigger fins like those fish. I just don't know, but those fish are starting to show some colors, and I wanted to let you know about that. Oh, I should throw this in about the columns. One thing about these water column things that we made is that they do get a little bit warmer. So if we hit this with the temperature gun, you'll see a reading of 82 degrees. And if we hit the main pond water surface, 77-ish. So it makes sense, this water would get a little bit warmer, but again, the fish can self-regulate, they can move themselves in and out of it. And I do tend to see them more often in the columns, in the morning and the evening, just trying to regulate the temperature. They like it a little bit warmer, I guess. That's gonna bring us back to the fish room. I gotta turn the dehumidifier off. I'm counting these as in the fish total of how many fish we're dealing with. Can you see how many we have? Medaka black rice fish. I will be counting these and including it in the title / thumbnail of the video. Here's some platinums that we've harvested so far. Water's a little bit more green. Again, this is great. I wish we had this level of green over here. Here's the first batch of the platinum medakas. Again, in a little bin that is perfect. All this little algae, the discoloration of the water, full of microorganisms, perfect for them. That just means we don't have to feed them as much, even though I still do feed them a lot. Like we got this little tiny fry bites or what, I don't know what I can't read that, but they get that no matter what. I think that also helps, like anything that's uneaten just goes to fuel the green water, and then more passive food for these tiny little fry. Don't forget about the baby rainbow shiners from the bootleg guys out there. There's still, I think there's like 6 of them in here. Like this is still a perfect little spot for them. There's some uneaten food up there. We'll just kind of wipe that in there. And they got plenty of stuff to chew on. We'll see. Yeah, I'm just gonna continuing to build the fish army over here. But I think with the temperatures out there being in the mid to upper 70s, that's kind of what that's close to what they have in here. I think it's the perfect time to start adding our fish. And that's gonna bring me into, I guess, the last tip that I have, and that's just consolidation / organization of all your stuff. It sort of ties into everything else that we've talked about, but if you have a fish room, just keeping things kind of in the same area. So the rice fish row, the guppy row, or the hard water fish row. I haven't followed that completely to a T because we have like a rice fish tank right here, and there was gonna be one over here. There's nothing in this one, but I think you get the point. Like just putting things into boxes as us humans like to do. And I realize, look, I'm not the most organized person. You can see the background of this fish room and how long it's been this way for, but I do my best. And my weird organization skills, it's gonna be unique to person, I'm sure, or at least I hope it is, because that's what I use to cope with it. So just keeping things in the boxes that you like to put them in and the places that they live and the things that you do, that has to make sense. I'm having a hard time explaining it, but I think you get the drill. We're going to now lighten my load in the fish room by taking some of these fish that need to go out with their cousins, or I guess their parents, right? These are all from the original fish. We're gonna end up lightening our load in here, have actually less tanks to worry about, and that consolidation is just gonna help the whole process and eventually lead to me having these restocked with baby fish next year, and the process continues. The cycle never stops. I had to wait for the sun to go down. It was another hot one today, but all the fish are doing good. We didn't add anybody to this pond, but you can finally see the minnows a little bit cooler. They come out, probably do another feeding, feed about 2 to 3 times a day if I remember to. I tried to do the best job that I could with selecting what fish we want to put into these populations that are our main breeders. I'm not an expert at culling fish, but every season, hopefully I'll get a little bit better and we can keep getting better and better fish. So it's really important to do that. Put a couple more yokihis in this. Some of them are a little bit smaller. They were just some juveniles that we did some breeding with in the winter. So not quite full size, but hopefully by the end of this season, they'll be closer to it. They're kind of hard to see, the midnight madakas, but even some of the small ones that we put in today are exploring the little tubes that we made last week, so that's cool to see. Our sponge filter is still running. How much battery do we have? Got a couple more bars, but maybe we can get a peek and you can see some of the colors on these fish that I was trying to explain. It's gonna be really hard to see, probably impossible. They move so fast. There's still a bunch more fish that we haven't completely dealt with out of that room, but we added a decent amount. We consolidated, so there's less tanks in there that I have to worry about. And specifically with those ones, that's nice because those are ones that do build up nitrate and that I have to keep an eye out on and do water changes on. So with less of that, putting them into environments where the nitrogen is not an issue, that's always a big relief. I think that's all I wanted to accomplish today. And with the video, we talked about kind of some of the things that I have to deal with my fish room. Hopefully it wasn't too long of a video, but I thank you for hanging in there and I hope you enjoyed it. So we'll get back to work. We have some more pond related things to do for next week's video. So if you're into this stuff, be on the lookout for that. Thanks again for watching and we'll see you next week. So the sink's still on. All right, this is the extended Blu-ray Director's Cut edition. If you made it this far, this is your treat. So golden white cloud minnows. Let's get a zoom, dude. There are so many in here. There's like one big one there in the middle, but so many little babies are all over the place, right? If you stayed to the very end of the last video or the one before then, you probably already saw this, but yeah, I'm counting all of these fish in the title, okay, slash and or thumbnail. These count. These are part of the collection. I'm thinking there's probably maybe still like 80 fish in here, if I had to guess. So was thinking that a bunch of them were gonna die, because that's just what happens. But as you can see, there's a good angle if I just hold still. So many. We are going to, I mean, who knows how many we're gonna have to cull out of this many, or how many will only make it another week before just giving out. Like that's definitely something that happens. But I mean, we're gonna have a lot more for next year that we did, or at least we're gonna have a lot more this winter to bring inside and to grow up. So very exciting, cool. Thanks again for watching, guys, for the 7,000th time. See you later.